If you're like most Bloxburg players, then most of your builds probably start out looking like garbage, and that goes out to any player no matter how long they've been playing. I'm just kidding, that only happens when you watch stuff on my channel. But I've put together a small compilation of some of the main tips and tricks that I use in my own builds to maybe help you improve your building as well. And if they don't help, then oh well, I call that a skill issue. Before any build really starts cooking, you need to throw in the raw ingredients, which is the whole idea and vision for what you want to build. You could also call this inspiration, but I'm just trying to be different. Personally, I find most of my inspiration from either Pinterest or Twitter, two social platforms that have a huge pool of users that will provide you with all the creative spark that you need. And of course, there are other sources of inspiration like YouTube and Instagram, but Pinterest and Twitter are where you can find a lot of the builders who share their ideas for others. And then there are hashtags that bring you to builders that specialize in Bloxburg building. So this is a very good start for when you're trying to find an idea. And when it comes to inspiration, you don't need to necessarily stick to a single image or post. You can combine different elements of an idea into one, which kind of emphasizes originality in whatever you build, no matter how garbage it might be. Anyways, once you have your inspiration done, you can move on to your next step, which is walls. I guess you could say walls are kind of the most basic thing when it comes to building, but they're also the most complex in a way. See, many people don't understand what it means to place down a wall, but don't worry, neither do I, which is not very reassuring. The most I can really say about a wall is that you should keep it interesting when you're building a house in Bloxburg, and try to juice it up with some character and dimension, and then it'll somehow pop. But you also don't want to go overboard with your interesting, because then you're just building more garbage. There's like this ooh la la level of interesting when it comes to making the shell of your house, and the rule of thumb that I normally follow when it comes to doing this is that no wall should be longer than 6 grid spaces long or shorter than 2 grid spaces, with some exceptions when adding extrusions. And what I mean by extrusions is when you take, let's say, a wall that's this long and then you extrude it out by 1. If a wall needs to be longer than 6, then you can divvy that up using a couple of doors, windows, or columns, or like I just showed you, the extrusions. And the shape that ends up getting drawn with your wall should also take into account the floor plan that might follow it. I'll talk more about this later in the video, but the main takeaway is that your build shouldn't look like SpongeBob SquarePants or Squidward tentacles. I think something like this would be a pretty fantastic start to a build, but that's just me, and I can only see the vision for the front part. Usually for the back, I can't really see that until the very end, so I'll just leave that for now. The next thing we can move on to is doors and openings, and this includes doors and windows and basically anything that allows for things to penetrate into the build, like sunlight. And I guess starting with doors, the main ones usually include the front door, the back door, and then garage doors, with the occasional side entry, but that's kind of optional. To be honest, you can place these anywhere you see fit, or you could just refer back to the part where I talked about inspiration to help you with that. But as long as you can get in and out of your build, then you should be fine. And when it comes to doors, I'd suggest using the default ones that you get in game, and the selection is pretty good. But if you want to take it a step further, then you can experiment using fence gates. So I'll do a little something here with this door, and I'll just remove this really quick. And I'm gonna place an opening just about here, and that should line up. And then next you want to place a fence, and then bring a fence gate into the picture. And then your opening may simply be resized to whatever shape your door is. And you need advanced placing for this, so I wouldn't recommend for any new players. And then just to buff it all out with your structurals, you could place one at the top and resize it just to keep it flush with the wall. And here you have a door that looks a little more realistic than the ones that we have in game, or it just gives you a different design to try out. I think personally I'll be using this door a lot more. And what's great about it is that once you do it once, you can do it once again with your fences and fence gates. Although the only downside to this is that it takes a while to do, and you gotta do it for every single door once you've done it to one door. But if you're looking to try hard, then this is what you're gonna do. But anyways, moving on to windows. Windows are nice. They let you see into a build and also allow for natural light to pass into the space, although this isn't a very good example since there isn't very much light passing through, but you get the idea. Especially in Bloxburg, artificial light is really hard to work with, and you really want to take advantage of as much natural lighting as you can get, because if you fill your space with institutional white lighting, then it's gonna look very blinding. But you also don't want to use linen all the time, because then it's way too warm. To get a sort of realistic tone, you kind of want to experiment with a variety of different colors. So for example, if you use institutional white, it's way too bright, but if you use linen, then it's way too warm. But linen is the general color that most people use. But if you want to go for something realistic, then you could use flint. But anyways, lighting is not too big of an issue right now. Returning to windows, of course this doesn't mean you should spam your walls with windows. Sometimes less is more, and sometimes you don't want to make your whole wall see-through. Unless you're building a modern home, then maybe you'd consider using this window, but aside from that, I wouldn't really recommend for any traditional homes. And since since I'm using the traditional home as an example, I'll stick to using these for the video. But the type of window that you use is really dependent on your build, and you can refer back to your inspiration for this. But when it comes to window design, you can either stick with the ones that they give you in Bloxburg right here, and this is really recommended for anyone that doesn't have all the game passes, or if you do have the game passes, then you can crank up the heat with structural and basic shapes. But I recommend sticking with structurals when it comes to windows, otherwise it gets really hard to make them copy and pasteable and just movable in general. And I'll show a very quick tutorial of how to do the windows. It's really self-explanatory, and you just use a bunch of structurals around it. And I do this all the time in any of my builds, so if you want to go check out any of the other videos, then feel free to do so. I do this quite often, so I'm kind of used to it. But anyways, we're now going to move on to roofing, dormers, and other roofing elements. And I'm going to use this video that I recorded a couple weeks back where I'm building my dream house, and I think this does a really good job of showing what I did with the roofs and what I'm going to explain to you just in a sec. So now that you're finished with the walls and windows, you can now start working on shaping the lid of your build. And sometimes this may be more complicated than it seems. Auto-generated roofs are nice, but sometimes they fail to give you what you want to see in your build. For example, sometimes you want a little more shape and variety. So what I usually do is separate the roof in a number of segments, and then I make use of several different roofing types to achieve what I want. So I don't know if this is a good representation of what I did with this dream house, but these are all of the separate roofs that I've used to make up the one roof that caps off the house. This green one's a gable, blue one's a gable, red one is a gable, the yellow one's a gable, the orange one's also a gable, and then this mix right here is this purple one right here is a I think it's a hip roof, and then that tip connects with this tip, and I don't know how to explain it, but this is how many roofs are put into one single roof to make a roof. Yeah, that definitely doesn't make sense. But to put it all into perspective, this is what comes out of all of that monstrosity, and it honestly doesn't look too bad. This is what I meant by this tip matches with that tip, and yeah, I'm not gonna go into that. But this is a pretty good example of how you can resize your roofs as well, like the height of them, and then also manipulate the length of them to make space to add these other elements that can support the structure of your build. Although this example might be a little more advanced since I'm building on a diagonal here, the main thing I'm trying to say is that you should take your time with your roofs and try to picture it as a handful of puzzle pieces that work together to make one shape, and eventually it'll turn out pretty good. And then that brings us to structural integrity. Structural integrity is important when it comes to making a build look feasible or realistic even, although it is Bloxburg, so you can choose to ignore this tip if you want. But structural integrity is basically just reasoning. For example, would an overhang like this look right? Probably not. And what it needs is support. So you can use a column or ceiling support to make it seem a little more, you know, real. It's pretty self-explanatory, but I always see people in public servers hanging their roofs over the edge of their walls or creating second floors that just float above the first. Might be a little opinionated, but I think it makes the build look a bit goofy. So yeah, structural integrity. And so that brings us to basic shapes and structurals. For new players and anyone who isn't confident with building using the default game mechanics, I suggest not touching these, but if you want to give it a go, be my guest. Personally, I haven't mastered building in Bloxburg either, but basic shapes and structurals can be used to make anything and everything that isn't already offered in the game. And here's a simple example with the roofing, but nothing more used in the build. They get really expensive as you continue using them, and sometimes it's just not worth it when you can simply use something that's in the game already. Basic shapes and structurals are one of the more complex things that come with experience, and they can either make or break your build, so use them with heavy consideration. Although this doesn't mean you should completely avoid them though, because you know, they make the build look sexy. And that brings us to elevations. Now that the majority of the build is finished, we can focus more on its surrounding environment. Something you can try in your own build is adding elevations. This includes light hills and abrasions to give the environment surrounding your build a little more character. Although it's just a suggestion, personally, I don't really focus on this too much, and adding these things is kind of useless unless I'm building something like a hillside or lakeside house, which requires a little more attention to landscaping. But it's just a little idea for you, and it adds a little more, you know, re-dimension. Which finally brings us to the one you've all been waiting for, which is the gardening. Gardening is one of the most crucial aspects of making a build look amazing, and doing your yard work can take a mediocre build and elevate it to an eye candy level. You can take a look at the difference between a house without gardening and then a build that does have gardening. It's actually kind of mind-blowing. And when it comes to gardening, there isn't much that you really need to remember. Just try to keep the placement of your objects organic and natural, and this means you should typically stay on the small grid to place your items, so that way it's not too organized. Moving on, something you might want to try is to fit in a variety of gardening items as well to help your build feel more naturally integrated into its environment. Aside from that, there aren't many tips that I can think of off the top of my head. This stuff usually comes with experience and takes a lot of fiddling around with to get to a point where it looks really good. And I'm not not saying this looks really good because this is from a year ago and I definitely could do much better than this. But this can be used as like a starting point or something. And if you want to take it even further, you can use decals, structurals, and basic shapes to bring realism into your build. But like earlier, I wouldn't recommend doing this unless you've gotten a hang of working with what's offered in the game already, because decals can take a build from 10 out of 10 to 12 out of 10 if they're used properly. They can also completely ruin your build if there's absolutely zero synergy. And this is speaking from experience. This is a build I did maybe a year ago in 12 hours, and I've gotten the hang of it a little more, but it's clearly still not as refined, but it's definitely an improvement. As you can see with these three, it clearly doesn't hurt to keep trying until you make it. So good luck if you want to use decals. And if you really want to use decals, one thing I suggest doing is making bushes, because those are pretty much the easiest thing you can do with them. All that you quite literally have to do is take a basic shape, the transparent one, and then resize it to its skinniest, and then take your decal, and I'll leave the code in the description below, and then place it on the transparent cube to move it around anywhere you want, and then those can act as bushes for your house. And what's great about these is that you can resize them to any height you want. If you want the bush to be thicky nicky, all you have to do is put another decal and it should do the trick. But where it gets more complicated is when you start making the tree, and I'll try to break it down as easily as possible for you here. So let's take the simplest tree on the plot and try to dissect it. This is basically a basic shape, and then it's resized down to probably one of its skinniest forms, and then it's dragged upwards and recolored, so this acts as the trunk of the tree. And like the bushes, all you have to do is take a transparent cube and slap it on top of the tree, and then this will act as the top of your tree, and then all you have to do is kind of resize those, and then for the rest of it, all you have to do is place the decals on, and there we go, you have a tree. One thing I recommend doing with the decal trees though is making the bottom a little thicker than the top, because usually in real life trees there's more weight on the bottom, so that's my reasoning. But before you actually do this, make sure you have enough money, because this thing costs 6.7k. And then that's basically the gist of making trees. To do anything more complex like this, all you're doing is basically making more of these and chucking them on more basic shapes. So for example, what if this was a trunk? Then all you would be doing is putting this up here, and then this is where the transform tool comes into play, and then you'd just be rotating all of these so-called branches around until your tree looks a little more plump. Obviously, your tree is not gonna look like this if you try hard enough. It'll look more like this, but that's basically how you do it. If I were to try to break down this tree, I don't think I could do it, but I'll try to highlight the parts. So there's this branch, then there's also this branch, and then there's also this branch, and you'll realize that they're actually all the same branch, just rotated in different directions. And if there's ever a time where you need to make the tree a little more thick, like we did earlier, all you have to do is make a bush and transform it up. But make sure when you're placing these, you're placing it on a basic shape, so that way the whole thing is copy and pastable. Keep in mind that you can't really move it all the way up unless you place it on a higher platform. And if you want to go a step further and make this 1 giga tree, all you have to do is the same process. It's literally the tree we made before, and the tree we made before, and you guessed it, the same tree we made before, all placed on top of this one stump. Of course, there are exceptions like this branch and this branch, but you'll also realize that those are the same tree. So making bigger and bigger trees is just basically stacking more little trees on top of each other, if that makes sense. Anyways, the only downside to doing this is that it is a little complicated and it takes a bit of time to work with. And on that note, decal gardening can get very, and I mean very expensive. Just look at this one tree that costs 90k. Simply fantastic and a waste of my money. Anyways, I've pretty much gone through most of the things that have to do with improving the exterior of your build, so now we can move towards the interior, and we can start with the floor plan. The floor plan of your build is super important to think about because it controls the flow of movement, and this isn't something I can really elaborate on since I'm not too good with floor plans either, but I can give some simple tips and tricks to help control your layouts. First up, something you want to avoid doing is making your rooms a bit too large, and I see that this is especially the case with people that want to make mansions, especially ones with very simple wall shapes, like this giant rectangle that I've built here. Basically, having too large of a room will make it very difficult to fill up space. So to avoid this, you want to divide your space into several mid-sized or small rooms. Something else you can do is maintain an open concept, and what I mean by that is just adding open door frames. It's not the best idea to make all your rooms closed off with doors. So what you can see that I've done in this build is remove a wall right here, or add an opening, or even a little partitioning element like like the stairwell to make the transition between your rooms a lot smoother, just like my brain. And with that being said, don't be afraid to make some of the spacing in your build redundant, which means you can just leave it empty without a purpose, and sometimes rooms end up looking a bit awkward, so it may be better just to set it aside. And one last thing with floor plans includes room purposing. The way I think about it, the great living, kitchen, and dining rooms should be somewhat interconnected, while the bedroom should be separate from those rooms. And you could use my dream house example, although you can't really tell what's what. The left side is the living, kitchen, and great room, while the right side is a bedroom. I think that's a bathroom, and this is a bedroom, and that's an office. So basically, main stuff on the left, other stuff, living stuff on the right. Everything else like bathrooms and pantries and utility rooms will fall into place next to one of these larger rooms. And with that, we can, unfortunately, return to the use of decals on the interior. And I haven't experimented too much with this myself, but using decals as a floor texture may bring a lot more realism into your build. You can even use them on walls, but it's a little challenging to get them to work around other elements like windows and doors. However, this might be a bit too excessive, so sticking to the Bloxburg material palette is a pretty good choice as well. And so that brings us to coloring. And if you've stuck around my channel for long enough, you'll know that I'm the least qualified person to be educating anyone on this, but I'll give it a go. The best way I can put this is, if you can't color or you don't know how to, find some more inspiration and try to copy what you think works. And that's what I did with this backyard set right here, but it still doesn't really match the color scheme of the house, so I might have to change that later. So if that's still not working for you, you should consider watching this how-to color video from Noel, because man, I can't color for shit. And that takes us to the end of all the things that I consider when I'm building, to maybe help you improve your own building skills. And as a final bonus tip, just build. You have absolutely zero idea how much that means, and if you're bored, just build. It doesn't matter if it's garbage or not, or if it's impressive or not. Just building anything can help you sharpen your skills and take you to the next level. And to all the new players from Bloxburg becoming free, don't let the veterans bully you. They're just scared that one day you'll be building better than they are, and that includes me, so don't get better than me, please.